In the late 1940s into the early 1950s, the RAF is facing a crisis. Having brought into service the first generation of jet fighters, in the case of the Vampire and the Meteor, it suddenly finds itself that these aircraft are outclassed. At this particular time, the Royal Australian Air Force are flying the Gloster Meteor against North Korean forces that include the new generation of MiG fighters. And something has to be done to improve the RAF's combat readiness. They initially, as a stopgap, purchased the North American Sabre, but they have to rush into production essentially a second generation jet fighter. And that leads to this fantastic aircraft behind us, the Hawker Hunter. Like a lot of aircraft, especially new technology, it had a number of teething problems. But once those were ironed out, the aircraft became a huge success for the British aircraft industry, exported to over 20 nations around the world and utilised by at least one of those until 2014. It would see action in a number of wars and conflicts, and it would also become a popular appearance on the air show scene, flying in displays from 1952 until the tragic events at Shoreham in 2015. Finally, an aircraft just like the version behind me here was very famously flown under the top span of Tower Bridge, and we'll talk about that story a little bit more later on. The prototype Hawker Hunter first flew in 1951, only 6 years after the end of the Second World War. And as an example of just how big a leap forwards in technology it was, the RAF aircrew flying, for example, the Spitfire towards the end of the Second World War would have been given one of these, a pilot's notes book, very, very thin, pretty basic, covering the main aspects of flight in a Spitfire. By the time the Hunter's in service, we're through to a binder, a huge amount of technical detail. Of course, things like ejection seats feature in here as well. But just in those two publications, we can see how much of a leap forward the Hunter was in the RAF.
Well, the Hunter was a great step forward because, of course, it was a swept-wing aircraft and you can fly faster and with better control. The thing with the Hunter 1 really was it didn't really have the range. 35, 40 minutes, you really didn't want to be too far away from where you had to get back down.
The Hunter is in super priority production for the RAF and it's also being built under license in Holland and Belgium. She too can fly at supersonic speeds. That's one of the shock clouds characteristic of sonic flight. Now, wait for it.
The biggest differences between the Hawker Hunter and the aircraft that it's replacing, like the conventional straight-wing Vampire or Meteor, is that swept wing, reducing turbulence and therefore friction through the air. As well, it has a nice high tail, again helping with control and stability as speeds and manoeuvrability increases. The first production variants of the Hunter, the F1 and the F2, powered by the Avon and Sapphire engines, had a number of teething problems. They were then developed, becoming the F3, which was actually a modified version of the prototype, designed to make an attempt on the world absolute speed record. A record it broke at over 727 miles an hour in September 1953. By the time we get to the F6, those problems have been ironed out and resolved, and by taking a close look at the aircraft behind us, we can see how some of those designs were changed, and we'll go and have a close look. Early versions of the Hawker Hunter had a conventional straight, smooth leading edge to the wing. By the time we get to the Hunter F6, the Avon has gained more power, causing the aircraft to have pitch-up problems. The improvement required to solve that and maintain its handling is this rather unconventional dog-toothed shape wing. It might look a bit unconventional, but in having this on the aircraft, it did keep the aircraft's famed manoeuvrability intact.
Its manoeuvrability in my hands was initially limited, but then a modification called the sawtooth leading edge was introduced, and also the further modification was to the tailplane structure, which gave one much better control. And by the time I left the squadron, even I didn't lose control quite so frequently in those days.
When the Hawker Hunter was first envisaged, it was in a time before air-to-air missiles had been suitably developed. So the aircraft was actually equipped with a fairly conventional armament. In this case, 4 Aden cannon. In the early versions, however, as the spent cartridges fell away from the aircraft, they would fall back towards the air intakes and to the engine, causing problems, leading to later versions from the F4 onwards gaining these cartridge collection pods, often referred to as Sabrinas. So we've come round to the other side of the Imperial War Museum's Hunter so that we can take a close look at the gun pack under the belly of the aircraft. The gun pack itself is designed to be lowered to remove the spent ammunition and also to reload the guns. It would be lowered by a winding handle on both sides, and a well-polished and practiced ground crew could turn this aircraft around to get it back in the fight in a very, very short space of time. So the Hawker design team had produced an incredibly new design for the Air Force, and the results of all that new technology made it a real pilot's aeroplane. It was relatively fast for its time, not supersonic in level flight, but certainly capable of supersonic speeds in a dive, and it was incredibly manoeuvrable as well. Everything that a pilot would have wanted to have taken a jet into a dogfight.
The early marks of the Hunter, they weren't anything really to write home about, but the Hunter went on and, as you know, became a genuinely memorable aeroplane, not quite as legendary as the Spitfire, but getting on that way. A very good, as a second generation fighter, an excellent one.
The Hunter was an aerobatic aircraft and lent itself to performing at air shows. A number of display teams here in Britain were formed around it, such as the Black Arrows and the Blue Diamonds, which in many respects were the precursors to the modern day Red Arrows. However, in the case of the Black Arrows, at the Farnborough Air Show, they decided to try and loop a huge number of jet aircraft. They pulled together 22 aircraft and were able to complete an entire loop over the air show, a feat that has not ever been bettered.
The pictures you're seeing now are historic in that they capture, at the very height of their fame, a magnificently coordinated team that is no more. A page of glory that can never be erased from the history of aviation.
The Hunter's main intended role was to be as an interceptor fighter. Much like the Spitfire had done during the Battle of Britain, now the Hunter was going to be used in a similar role against possible incursions into British airspace by aircraft operated by, amongst others, the Soviet Air Force.
Their name dramatically describes the role for which these turbojets were intended. They must hunt, and like the Hawks, they must be as fleet as the wind in the pursuit of their prey. This may be just another exercise, but it is going to be an exact replica of the real thing.
The Hunter was incredibly useful for a period, but of course technology is always moving onwards, leading to supersonic level flight and the addition of air-to-air missiles, something that the Hunter is not able to be adapted with. So it sees a shift in its initial role from a fighter interceptor designed to defend to an aircraft that actually moves into a ground attack role. The early ones suffered from a lack of fuel and therefore range. In the case of the ground attack Hunters that see out service in the RAF, the fuel tanks become standard so that they can carry out range of missions behind the front lines. In RAF service, the Hunter would see action at both the time of the Suez conflict and in defence missions around the Aden Protectorate. In both of these occasions, they did operate in both an air defence role and also in a ground attack role. The Hunter would be utilised to take out enemy positions that were causing problems to troops in contact on the ground. Lessons learnt from the Second World War allowed forward air controllers to actually call in aircraft that weren't that far behind the front line, and in the case of the later variants of the Hunter, they could call in rocket strikes with relative precision against enemy positions.
Beautiful aircraft. It was easy to look after. You know, it's a nice little size. It only weighed about 7 tons compared with the other ones. We could turn that aircraft around. We could fit rockets, guns, refuel it, and it could be offline again within 9 minutes. There was nothing fancy about it, but it was pretty much an ideal type of aircraft for what it was being used for. It was being phased out because everything was going on to, you know, supersonic and all the rest of it was, and it was good for the ground attack. That's what we used it for.
The Hawker Hunter becomes a great export success for the British aircraft industry. The earlier versions of jet aircraft in this country, such as the Vampire and Meteor, did see some initial success, but the Hunter was incredibly successful, being exported to over 20 nations around the world. And it also goes to the Lebanese Air Force, who, although they initially retire them in the early 2000s, regenerate a small number and incredibly are still flying them until 2014, allowing the Hunter's span of active use to span over 50 years, beating the previous record of the English Electric Canberra. In 2018, the Royal Air Force celebrated their 100th anniversary. A huge formation of RAF aircraft was assembled to fly over central London to mark this momentous occasion. But amazingly, 50 years previously, on the 50th anniversary of the formation of the RAF, nothing spectacular had been planned. This led to Flight Lieutenant Alan Pollock taking matters into his own hands. He was tasked that day with flying a very brief fly-past event at an RAF base, but realised that if he broke away from that formation, he would be able to put in a brief appearance over central London in his Hawker Hunter.
Flew over the various bridges, and there was Westminster, and it was an incredible sight really, and I think I went round 3 times over the Houses of Parliament, because it just struck me that making a noise there was really what it was all about. And the strange thing was, at that very moment in Parliament, they were discussing, without a word of a lie, noise abatement and to do with aircraft noise. And then I just made my way out over the various other bridges, and then there ahead's Tar Bridge, sort of staring me right in the face, and it was just an interesting target, and I hadn't meant to go through it at all, but it was just too intriguing. And then there was a bus coming left to right, and I thought, well, the only way to do it safely is to go in to do a kind of reverse bombing run on the top span, and that's what I did. But everything was safe on the bridge apart from one cyclist that fell off with fright or something like that, and he actually wrote to me, and he didn't want any compensation at all.
Having completed his fly-through of Tower Bridge, he goes back to his airbase, lands, expecting to face the consequences. But they're consequences that never really come. He's not court-martialed or hauled in front of his superiors, as it's often viewed that that would have been bad publicity in a time when the RAF should have been marking a significant anniversary. The Hawker Hunter would of course find its day that it in turn had to be replaced. It would be replaced by numerous airframes such as the supersonic English Electric Lightning. Following retirement from the RAF and other nations around the world, the Hawker Hunter moved into civilian hands to be displayed privately at air shows and events around the country. A very popular addition to most air show lineups. Unfortunately, things would all change in 2015, when a Hawker Hunter operating at the Shoreham Air Show unfortunately crashed and killed a number of people outside of the air show arena. It's changed the way that air shows are flown, and we haven't seen any significant performance by classic jets at British air shows since.
The Black Arrows have flown into history, but Treble One Squadron lives on as a tribute to the Royal Air Force. A powerful deterrent to anyone foolhardy enough to think that the warning in the squadron's motto, "Standing by," is nothing but an idle boast.